Okay. I've shared my screen. Are people seeing it?
Yes.
I thought I'd begin with kind of a retrospective of the genesis of PyMovie. It started from an observation from Tony George that from time to time people get videos that have been affected adversely by wind gusts that have sprung up and affected their recordings. On the left panel here, we can see what that looks like. So this was the star, but at some point a wind gust came along, and so during the exposure of that frame, the star image was dragged across the pixels, and you get this kind of dog bone effect. With the available tools at the time, in order to capture all the light from this star being smeared across the aperture, a large circular aperture would be used, and I show that in the center. Now, theoretically, that's not the greatest thing that you want to do, because you're also going to include many pixels that really don't have information from your star. Instead, you're getting pixel noise. So the idea behind PyMovie was to compute a mask that would eliminate most of the pixels that did not belong to light from the star. And on the right, we can see what one of those computed masks looks like. Now, a mask is a binary mask, so wherever you see white, we include the signal from those pixels. Wherever it's black, we exclude. So we simply sum the pixels that correspond to this mask being overlaid on this image. I have another similar one just so you can see the same effect being repeated. So here was an image that had been distorted, smeared, if you will, by wind shake, and this is what the computed mask looked like. So this was the reason that PyMovie got started, because we already had LiMovie and Tangra, which are doing perfectly good jobs on images that didn't had no effect from wind shake. So what I want to say is that my experience has been, when I went into this, I thought, oh boy, by eliminating this circular mask and by going to a computed mask like this, we're going to get light curves that have a better signal to noise ratio. A little bit of that's true, but I'm going to admit that in fact, that is seldom very obvious in your light curves. And the reason is, while in fact this technique does reduce pixel noise, it doesn't do anything for scintillation noise, frame to frame noise, and that noise usually dominates. So the first excitement over, oh boy, if we don't use this big circular mask and use this nice computed mask, we're going to get better signal to noise ratio. That is rarely accomplished in any significant way in practice. So the other promise was that by using a computed mask, we would be sure to get all of the light, and we wouldn't get dropouts because we had a small aperture, perhaps only involving a fraction of the pixels that were in fact affected by the light. What I found in practice, that a big circular aperture does a great job of picking up all of that light. Once you get over the idea that, oh, that's going to make my observation noisy, once you realize that actually that's not a very large effect in reality, it's perfectly fine to go ahead and use a big circular mask. So iMovie and Tangra are perfectly within their rights to say, when you've got wind shake, just use a big circular mask. So what I have ultimately come to realize is that PyMovie has been successful in rescuing some wind shake videos, but not because it gathered all of the light from the star smear, and not because it reduced the pixel noise. It just tracks better. This idea of computing a mask and using it to track the image has been the real effect, unintended, unexpected effect of using a computed mask. Now, you might get some idea of why this might be so. When PyMovie tracks, it tracks using the computed mask, and it uses the binary mask. So when it asks, where is the center of that image, it says, it's about here. Now, the other way that people figure out where in a smeared image the center is by using pixel intensity weighted algorithms, which basically says that the center of this image would have been discovered here. I was working with a Pluto group and was asked to do a test where the test was to take an image. It was from a Pluto observation, and there were two stars that were fairly well distance apart on the image. And I was asked to compute the center to center distance using the centroid of the computed mask and compare it with using the light weighted center, and to just look at the distribution of distances. And what we found was there was a lower sigma for the star-to-star distance that was computed using the computed mask than using the light-weighted mask, which means, roughly speaking, a lot of hand waving going on here, that the centroid of mask way of looking at the position of an image is a more stable measure. It was almost 2-to-1 in the sigma difference between star distances measured with centroid of the computed mask versus centroid of the light weighted center. So that's my retrospective. PyMovie got started for one reason, and I think that it has had some success, but for a reason that was not expected at the beginning. At this point, I'd like to bring up PyMovie, and I'd like to demonstrate a feature that I have found most useful for me, and I want to make sure that people who are using PyMovie are aware of this feature and how easy it is to use. So what I will do is go through my own best practices whenever I get a video and use that to demonstrate this feature. So I'm going to pick a folder and I'm going to bring up a video. And the first thing I do when I see the video is I go to my image control and I do some adjustments to get a better looking image. You have to turn off the image control so that those settings remain fixed. So my problem is that I have difficulty relating an image like this to a star chart. So I have difficulty finding where the target is. So for my own purposes, I developed a finder generation which reduces the background noise and gives an image that it is easier to correlate with a star chart. To do that, you activate the Finder tab, and I'm going to set a redaction of lines from the top. As you notice on the top of this image right here, there is, I think this comes from a QHY, so this is what you see on the QHY plus the overlaid timestamp. Now these are things that I want to redact as I generate my Finder frame. I'm going to use 400 frames, and to align these frames I'm going to choose some star. I'm going to do a snap to blob, and you have to call it something that begins with STACK for stack. And once you've done that, you're ready to go. When you say generate Finder, you get this little question box, and it asks if the timestamp data has been completely removed. And so here is the area that I redacted. So that's what this number 20 refers to. I replace the 20 top lines with the median value of the pixels down here. So I'm just going to say yes. And once you say yes, it begins scanning. It's going to do all 400 frames. We are up to frame 120 right now, so it doesn't take very long. What it's doing is it's finding where that star is in each of the frames, starting from frame 0 to frame 399. Once it reaches 399, it begins to stack them and produce a Finder image. Now this is an image that I find much easier to find the asterisms that are in the star chart. Let me get rid of this. I'm going to delete this. So at this point, I am able to relate this image to a star chart. So my step one, the first aperture that I place is on the target. And I know from my star chart that this is the target. So I'll do a right click and I'll do a snap to blob. Snap to blob means that it will, let me name this, I'm just going to call it target. And you notice when I finished typing the name, this aperture suddenly aligned itself to that blob. That's the snap to blob function. The next thing I do is I locate a reference star that is very similar to the magnitude of the target star. And this is a good candidate. So I again would use a snap to blob, and I would give it a name, reference. Next, I would find an area where there is no star, and it's very important to use a finder frame for this because the star field's pretty rich here, and so it's not all that easy to find a place where there is no star. I will add an aperture, which is a static aperture. There's nothing to snap to, so you just want it to pop into place. And I'm going to call that no star. Finally, I'm going to select a tracking star. This looks like a good candidate. So I will call that tracking star. And I just like to I turn my target star to green just as a matter of practice. It's unimportant actually, but if I'm going to record a snap of this to send to somebody, I like to say the green aperture, that's the target. It's just a lot easier to do that. So at this point, I'm ready to begin an analysis. So I will just start analyzing. And you see it snaps from the finder frame into the normal frame. And you can see the star field a little bit better when it's moving, but the static version is not that great. It's never been good enough for me, and that's why I put the work into developing that finder frame. I should say I demonstrated this feature to Hristo, and he's giving some thought to incorporating this into Tangra once he saw how I'd done it, and the fact that this mechanism is pretty simple to implement. He may incorporate that into Tangra. So hopefully you'll find that feature in Tangra sometime soon, although he's a pretty busy guy. So
Bob, while we're waiting, I would just mention that sometimes if you use a green aperture on the target star and it totally disappears, the green aperture will wander off. So I typically leave it on a red aperture for that reason.
actually, I forgot to do something here. I should have designated my tracking aperture to be a tracking aperture. Instead, I just made it a normal aperture. I should have turned it yellow.
That was the other thing I was going to mention.
Yeah, I just got carried away, and I think we'll find that this works just fine. Let's see what our plot looks like. Let's first of all look at, let me drag this down so we can see the green dots are no star, and we can see that that is admirably around 0. And the reason I recommend putting in a no star aperture is to make sure that the background extraction algorithm is working well. And this gives me some confirmation, in fact, that it has worked well. The red was our tracking star, which turns out I didn't use it as a tracking star. We were able to track perfectly fine without it. My reference was blue, and you can see that it did have an intensity that was very similar to my target star, and it looks like right here we had an occultation. So let me drop this composite. And this was the target signal. And in fact, we did have a nice occultation. I don't want to go into a lot of details, but that little black triangle indicates that we were no longer using a computed mask, but instead reverted to using a default circular mask. And that happens when there's so little light available that it is not possible to compute a mask. So let's drop that, and we can see that our reference signal shows that there wasn't anything bad going on. We're not really going to have to worry about cloud effects on this one. And here is detail of our no star. And so that's it. That's a demonstration of my typical best practices, except I should have turned this one yellow. Let me just do a return to Mark. Looks like that didn't do what I expected, but that's okay. At this point, I would entertain any questions because I'm ready to move on to IOTA. I wanted to leave a lot of time for people to ask questions about PyMovie, but I also wanted to give just an elementary demonstration of its use in practice as I do it.
Hey, Bob.
Yeah.
I have a question for you. This is Paul Maley. I often have to drive out into areas that there's a lot of wind present, and I'm trying to find out if you can quantify the level of wind speed that PyMovie can tolerate, and at what point do you think with a Celestron 8 that it is going to be impossible to continue past a certain wind speed?
Well, that would depend on the physics of your particular telescope and wind. I can only relate it to, let me just shrink this down and bring this guy back up again. I would say that PyMovie is going to be successful in tracking if the wind shake is such that your trail, the wind shake trail, stays within an aperture. So that's going to depend on a lot of factors that, you know, I can't give you a wind speed. All I can say is that, you know, if you had something that looked like this, it's likely to be successful in being able to track and give you a light curve. Does that help?
Actually, no, because I don't do any analysis. I depend on Tony to do that. I'm just out in the field doing the work, and when I do that, I have to do real-time assessment. I try to put my telescope without a windshield, light shield on the front of it, because that adds to the wind exposure. When I do that, sometimes it's impossible to get the occultation because the moon is in the way, provides too much, you know, input light. So I really wanted to try to get a handle at what point where, because I have to look at forecasted wind speeds for any potential site or sites that I have to travel to. And it's a real-time decision, and I just didn't know if you had a way to help me with that.
I don't, but perhaps Tony would. If we used as a metric, let's say the length of your wind shake trail in an aperture versus your reported wind speed, he could present a chart which said at such and such a wind speed you had a wind shake trail that was 20 pixels.
Bob, this would be a good point for you to bring PyMovie back and show them the new apertures that you recently added. That's one of the reasons that I asked you to increase the size was because of Paul Maley's wind shake issues.
Oh, really? Okay, let me see. So here's PyMovie. Let me get rid of some of these apertures. Oh, I could have gotten rid of those much quicker. You have quite a selection of aperture sizes. There had been just 11 to 51. That's a XY measurement or diagonal measurement if you wish. Tony's had some videos where 51 wasn't big enough. So we actually have up to a 91. And if we plunk one of those down here, you'll see a monster. Okay.
Yeah, so that's a lot of wind shake, and I've seen a lot of videos through the years. I don't think that there's any wind shake that I've ever seen that would get outside of that box size.
Let me just say though that if you had that much wind shake and it was an 8-bit camera, you probably would have effectively erased the image because the photon count per pixel gets below the threshold for actually registering a pixel count. If you have a camera like QHY or any of the cameras that have perhaps a 12-bit, you have a better chance of tolerating a high degree of wind shake. At least you don't lose the light due to this thresholding effect. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I was going to mention that that we typically track on the brighter stars, which have a better chance of capturing the full trail of the star. And then you might show them the option to use the yellow mask as the measurement aperture that then um, allows us to measure on top of the star as it trails, um, even though it may be a little fainter and that we couldn't see it by eye.
Yeah, I don't have a demonstration for that. That's quite an advanced and unusual thing to employ. You know, I wanted to keep this more simple rather than, oh, look at all the bells and whistles we got.
You know, just show them where it is, and then they can research it.
Let's see, where is it? It's right here. It's under miscellaneous. You can click this. And then if this were your tracking star, which needs to be yellow, whatever shape was necessary to the computed mask shape that appeared in here will be applied to the target. So it doesn't compute a mask from your target, it uses whatever mask it needed from the target, from the tracking star, and it just applies it up here. So that means that your target can be essentially invisible, but we're applying a correctly shaped, let's call it a wind shake mask, to the sampling of your target pixels. Does that help?
Yeah, and I've used this method a lot. It isn't perfect because, like you say, on an 8-bit video, the target star gets smeared so much that a lot of times it doesn't register.
And you get what happens then, of course, is you get an artificial dip, which could be confused as an occultation. That's the problem.
Right, but if you have other comparison stars, you can typically normalize that out. And so I like this method. I use it for wind shake, but you don't want to use it for other, typically you don't want to use it except for wind shake because you can actually increase your or decrease your signal to noise by using a funnier, larger mask from your tracking star.
Yes. So Paul, has that discussion helped you?
Yeah, it was helpful. David suggested putting a bag of rocks under my mount. I'm not sure if that'll. Well, I mean, that has worked in the past for lightweight equipment like cameras and small telescopes. But with a C8, I'm not sure I can do it. But I'm going to give it a shot because typically I'm out in the open. I have a very low profile Toyota Corolla, and so when I have my Celestron 8 deployed with a light shield on the front of it, the wind's going to hit it big time. And it's not uncommon for me to experience 15-mile-an-hour gusts. And so I need to find a way to overcome it. But thank you for the talk. It was really good.
Let me just say that if you had this chart that Tony somehow is magically able to conjure from available data that correlates the amount of smear versus the wind speed, would you elect not to go out and put up a station if the predicted wind gusts were above some threshold?
What I do basically is I look for multiple locations at different areas that will experience different weather conditions. I mean, as long as the sky is clear, I'm not too concerned. And I check wind as the next element. If I can find wind between 5 and 10 miles an hour, I will almost always go out in that. If it exceeds 10 miles an hour and I need to use a dew shield and it's high elevation, I have to weigh that. But typically, if the elevation is below 30, which almost always is these days, I can probably be fairly confident that I can actually capture the event with enough shielding from the car.
Okay. All right. So that would be a useful table. So I have a question. I mean, PyMovie was put together initially to deal with wind shake. I don't have a feel for how often it's actually been used and was able to rescue a wind shake affected video. Tony, you probably could comment on that best.
There has been very few videos that I've analyzed that had wind shake that PyMovie was not able to rescue. So I'd say 90% of videos with decently exposed stars with wind shake can be either rescued or greatly improved with PyMovie. And that's comparing to iMovie or Tangra, because neither of those programs use that centroid that you create with your mask. And so they all of a sudden lose track of the star, and once they lose track, then you get a break in your light curve, and it just doesn't work.
As I said in my opening remarks, that was an unexpected and kind of serendipitous discovery over the use of the computed masks. I was using computed masks for one reason. It turns out that reason ultimately ended up not being very significant, but we did have this other unexpected effect. So I'll go with luck. I'm
sure I could come up with an example that will test the limits of your aperture.
Okay. All right. The 91 aperture?
Oh, yes.
Okay. All right. Well, my other question really was, how many videos do you get, Tony, in which wind shake is a factor?
You know, lately it hasn't been that many. I don't know why. In the old days, it seemed like it was all the time. I know for me, when I was in Umatilla, I got a lot. But here in Arizona, I don't. A lot of the ones that I reviewed for others haven't been very windy in the last year or so. So right now it's about 10%. But that's, you know, when you're looking at some critical events or a critical chord, it's maybe the one that proves or disproves the event. It's been a lifesaver. So I like it. I would just add as an aside too that we have shared your mask methodology with both Elliot Young with the Pluto project and with Mark Bowie and the Recon team. And Mark recently shared in a different conference that he's now using that masking technique even on wind-shaped videos to do astrometry. He's actually using the wind-shaped mask for all the stars that are visible in the field, and then he does a centroid based on the tracking mask, and then does an actual astrometry to identify where his target star is. And so I think your technique is very powerful.
It was when I was working with Elliot Young when he was analyzing the Pluto curve, where they're looking at the atmospheric effects of the Pluto occultation, that I demonstrated this to him, and he was the one that made the suggestion of taking two stars that are well separated in the video and compare the distance between the stars using the two mechanisms. So that was his suggestion. I guess, as you know, he's a professor and he's lecturing to his students, and for that I was his student, and he charged me with prove something, try this. I should give him credit for that. Well, I think at this point I should move on to the PyOTA portion of this discussion. And the way to do that is once you've...
Would have one question while you're still on PyMovie, if you don't mind.
Sure.
First, thanks for writing it. It has made my analysis workflow much more palatable, so thank you for that. A question I do have, I am always, when I come back to it, forgetting what does a green aperture mean, what does a yellow aperture mean, what does a red aperture mean. And I noticed a lot of the interface refers to things by color first, and then only secondarily by what it really is, a target versus a reference versus a tracking aperture. So have you considered maybe in the GUI labeling menu items by what it is first and then color secondarily? Like, for example, I think in just a second. Examine change aperture settings. There's some point where it just says color green. And if I forget what green means, I don't know, does that mean it's a target? Does that mean it's a reference, etc.? So for me, at least, it would be helpful if it said, if there was a term like target versus tracking versus reference, and then color was secondarily, so that I have a clearer idea when I come back to the application every time. Oh, I forgot what green means, but I know what target means.
Okay, so I just brought up the aperture property list, and I just see it says color. What you'd rather see is tracking.
Right, yeah, because I remember tracking, boom, I know what that means, but yellow, I forget, I haven't made that association yet, that yellow is a tracking versus a target versus a reference.
Sure.
Well,
just a thought.
I would like to toss in, though, that you name the aperture. So if you call it tracking, it will show in that list.
Right, but right, as an overall name for that aperture, but in that as what type, I can change, once I name it, I can change it to a tracking or change it to a reference. And if the interface just says change by color, I forget what that means, where if it's always said change by a type name, that would be clearer to me.
Okay, so the only one where color is really tells you what kind of aperture it is yellow. Yellow is always tracking.
Yeah, let me take that.
Okay.
So I brought up the aperture group that I should have used. I'd actually saved this from a previous one. I just restored it. I forgot to turn this one yellow. The significance of a yellow aperture is that wherever it moves, all the other apertures move with it. So it locks, the presence of this yellow locks all of these into, let's call it an aperture asterism. So wherever this moves, so will they. Now, it turns out that if you don't have this, each aperture will self-track, and that is usually enough, but your target might disappear for long enough that when it reappears, it may have moved. That didn't happen in this case, so I got away with recording light curves without having a tracking aperture, but that's only because this was a tracked video. If it had been one where the star field was drifting, that might not have worked so well for me. So yellow is the one that is most significant. Green is mostly a color, but the other thing it does is it links it to this little spinner. So if I want to do some threshold changes, I can do it easily. But I think that goes beyond what I really want to talk about here. So I think we probably should move on at this point. So once we've completed our analysis, we're ready to move to PyOTA. If you have PyOTA installed, all you need to do is check this little box, and when you write the CSV, the light curves, I'm just going to reuse one that I wrote in the past. So when I do a save, it warns me that, ooh, you've already got one, but I recognize that that's an okay thing to do. So I simply say yes. And what happens now is it will start up PyOTA for me with this. Well, why didn't I get timestamps? We've had a meltdown for some reason. I don't know why that happened. Let me just start over. I'm just going to reanalyze this. We're getting timestamps. I don't know, I've been doing some funny things here. We're just going to redo this video.
So maybe while we're waiting, Bob, you could just highlight again what the different colors actually do represent.
So this is the tracking aperture. Also, whenever you hover over, the thumbnail changes to show you what the underlying image looks like. The green is just a color that I use to indicate the target. And red is just everything else. This was our reference star. You can see the mask being computed. This is no star. And this is our tracking star.
So one difference between red and green is that red, I believe, has like a 6 pixel radius in which it will track the blob, whereas green, okay, maybe 8 that. And then green can actually chase a blob across the screen, can't it?
No, that's the yellow. The tracking aperture, if this blob moves all the way up to the corner, it will find it and go to it. The other apertures, it only looks like in the center section. Another reason for using a tracking aperture if things are moving a lot. Okay, so let's do our plot, see if everything came out okay. Looks okay.
Hey Bob, a quick question, George Viscomi. How are you deriving your background measurements? It's not in the aperture itself outside of the mask, is it? How do you derive your background level?
I use every pixel that is in an aperture. Let me just do a plot. This is what your aperture looked like. This is where line by line I plot them, and I determined that all of this is a histogram of the pixels within that 31 by 31. And I determined that everything to the left of the red line belongs to background, and everything else are very likely to be pixels from the star. And that would be everything above this red line. So you can see that there are a number, but I then use all of the pixels that aren't from the star to compute a mean and a standard deviation. Okay, I don't want to go into that too deeply. Let's just see if we got success here. So this time we got our timestamps. Let me shrink this out of the way. So IOTA has come up.